For centuries, humanity has asked the same timeless question. Who are we, really? Are we simply biological organisms, complex, thinking animals shaped by evolution? Or are we something more? Beings capable of awareness beyond our physical existence? In this video, we will explore what philosophers, neuroscientists, and spiritual teachers alike call the awakening of human consciousness. A process by which humanity begins to understand not only how we think, but what it means to be aware at all. Neuroscientists can map brain activity, locate regions responsible for vision, memory, and emotion. But no one can point to a specific neuron and say, "Here lies awareness." This is what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. How and why does physical brain activity produce subjective experience? Why does the firing of neurons feel like something from the inside? For example, you can measure a brain IS reaction to the color red. But how do you measure the experience of redness itself? To understand the awakening of human consciousness, we must first trace its evolutionary roots. Billions of years ago, life began as simple single-celled organisms responding automatically to stimuli: light, temperature, chemical gradients. Over time, nervous systems evolved to process information more efficiently, allowing creatures to adapt, learn, and survive. With the rise of complex mammals, consciousness began to take on new dimensions. Mammals could not only perceive their surroundings, they could remember, plan, and even recognize themselves in mirrors. This gradual increase in cognitive complexity gave rise to self-awareness, the ability to not only experience, but to reflect on experience. Modern physics tells us that all matter is interconnected through energy fields. Neuroscience reveals that our brains are wired for empathy, that when we see another person in pain, our own pain center. This realization marks the first step in what we might call the awakening of consciousness. Psychologically speaking, awakening is a shift from identification to observation. It's the moment we realize, I am not my thoughts, emotions, or roles. I am the awareness that perceives them. This distinction lies at the heart of mindfulness and many modern therapeutic approaches. In cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, clients learn to observe their thoughts rather than react automatically to them. In mindfulness meditation, practitioners cultivate awareness of sensations, breath, and mental activity, learning to witness without judgment. Over time, as awareness deepens, individuals report profound psychological benefits: greater peace, emotional balance, compassion, and clarity of purpose. But awakening doesn't always begin with peace. Often, it begins with crisis. Moments of deep suffering, a loss, a breakdown, an existential crisis, can shatter the structures of the ego and force us to confront deeper questions of meaning. Psychiatrist Carl Jung called this process individuation, the integration of the unconscious into conscious awareness. He observed that people often awaken after confronting their shadow, the repressed parts of themselves they rather avoid. Regions that normally operate separately begin to communicate more coherently. It's as if the mind shifts from noise to harmony. This measurable change correlates with what meditators describe subjectively as inner stillness or oneness. Science, in this way, is beginning to validate what ancient wisdom traditions have known for millennia: that consciousness expands when the sense of separation dissolves. The awakening of consciousness is not merely an individual process, it is also collective. Humanity today stands at a technological advancement has given us immense power, but without wisdom, that power can destroy us. Climate change, artificial intelligence, social fragmentation, these are not merely external crises, they are reflections of our collective state of consciousness. As long as we remain driven by greed, fear, and competition, we perpetuate systems that exploit rather than sustain. But as awareness expands, when more individuals awaken to interconnection, our social values begin to shift. We move from domination to cooperation, from consumption to conservation, from me to we. This collective awakening doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds as individuals begin to live more consciously in their daily lives, questioning assumptions, acting with compassion, and aligning behavior with awareness. So, where is this all leading? What does an awakened humanity look like? In education, Awakening consciousness could mean teaching emotional intelligence and mindfulness alongside mathematics and science. In business, it might mean replacing exploitation with ethical innovation, creating value without harming life. In governance, it could mean policies rooted not in fear or control, but in empathy and sustainability. This isn't utopian idealism. It's an evolutionary necessity. Of course, awakening is not easy. It feeds on comparison, control, and certainty. It resists silence because silence threatens its existence. You can observe this resistance whenever you try to be still. The restless mind floods with thoughts, memories, and plans. Of course, awakening is not easy. The ego says, I must become enlightened, not realizing that enlightenment means the end of the one who seeks it. This paradox is what makes awakening so mysterious. It cannot be achieved through effort alone. It arises naturally when effort ceases, when awareness is allowed to simply be. As Zen masters say, stop trying to become, and you will realize what you already are. In today's world, information is abundant, but transformation is rare. We consume endless content about mindfulness, philosophy, and spirituality, yet still feel restless and disconnected. The reason is simple. Awakening is not intellectual, it is experiential. No amount of knowledge can substitute for direct awareness of the present moment. The mind wants to understand awakening as an object, but awakening is the subject itself, the one who sees. To awaken, therefore, is to shift from analyzing life to being fully alive. It is not about adding more, but about subtracting what is false, our beliefs, fears, and identities, until only awareness remains. Awakening is not only a personal journey. It has profound ethical implications. When we recognize the interconnectedness of all life, compassion ceases to be a moral duty and becomes a natural response. We no longer harm others because we see that in doing so, we harm ourselves. This is why every great spiritual tradition, from Christianity, love thy neighbor as thyself, to Buddhism, as principle of compassion, ultimately points to the same realization. There is no true separation between self and other. In an awakened society, ethics are not enforced by law, but guided by awareness. Responsibility arises spontaneously from understanding. The awakening of human consciousness is not a fleeting trend, it is the next stage of evolution. Just as life once evolved from single cells to complex organisms, consciousness now evolves from individual ego to collective awareness. We are the first species capable of consciously participating in our own evolution. This shift represents a new paradigm, from survival to self-realization, from competition to cooperation, from fear to understanding. The writer Pierre Teilhard de Chardin envisioned this in the early 20th century, calling it the noosphere, a global field of shared consciousness emerging through human minds. Today, through technology and global communication, that vision is beginning to take form. But whether it leads to unity or chaos depends on how consciously we engage with it. So how do we live this awakening in practical terms? Begin with attention. Notice your breath, your thoughts, your surroundings. When you catch yourself lost in mental stories, gently return to awareness. Practice empathy. Try to understand before judging. Speak truthfully, but with kindness. Consume mindfully. What you eat, what you watch, what you believe. And most importantly, remember, awakening is not about escaping the world. It is about seeing the world clearly and acting within it with wisdom. Each moment of presence, each act of awareness, is a ripple in the vast ocean of consciousness. And together, these ripples become a wave, one that can transform the very fabric of human civilization. The awakening of human consciousness is not a destination, it is a process. A continual unfolding of awareness through every experience, every challenge, every breath. Humanity stands on the threshold of a profound transformation. We can continue living from fear and separation, or we can awaken to the truth of our shared being. When we awaken, the world itself changes, not because reality shifts, but because the way we see it does. And in that seeing lies freedom, the freedom to live not as isolated fragments, but as expressions of one infinite consciousness exploring itself. The awakening of human consciousness has already begun. The question is, will we recognize it within ourselves?